Do you know what you are, little healer? Because I don't think you do.
The moonstone on my finger turned black the night my future ended. I remember the exact second it happened. The great hall of the verdant court, blazing with Fae light, my binding gown heavy with silver thread, and my fiancé, Prince Cale Thorn, laughing against the throat of another woman as though I were furniture no one had bothered to notice yet. 300 Fae watched me find out. 300 immortal faces, beautiful and cold as frost on glass, waiting to see what the human girl would do. I did not scream. I did not cry. Not there. Not where they could feed on it. I ran. I ran through a court that had spent 3 years teaching me I was lesser, out through a garden that had never once bloomed for me, and straight into a forest that human maps marked with a single warning. Here the wolves are kings. I did not know that within the hour I would be kneeling in the mud in front of the most powerful predator in 3 kingdoms, a crescent-shaped scar burning on my wrist for the first time in my life, and a stranger's voice, low, rough, terrifyingly calm, asking me the question that would unmake everything I thought I understood about my own blood. Do you know what you are, little healer? Because I don't think you do. I didn't. Not yet. But I would learn that the same court that called me broken had been hiding a truth in my skin worth starting a war over. I would learn that the king who found me shaking in his territory had buried a grief so deep he'd sworn never to love again. And that his hands, when they finally touched me, would be gentler than anything Cale had ever offered me freely. And I would learn, long before the Fae Prince ever came crawling back with apologies dressed as love, that being unwanted by one crown is sometimes the universe's cruelest way of delivering you to the one that was always meant to be yours. This is the story of how I stopped being the girl nobody chose, and became the queen an entire kingdom would burn for. Chapter 1. My name is Elowen Hart, and for 3 years I lived inside a court that never once let me forget I did not belong there. The arrangement had been made before I was old enough to understand what it cost. My village, Hartwell, sat on the human side of an old boundary, a line drawn generations ago after a war that had nearly unmade 3 worlds. The treaty that ended it was simple on paper and impossible in practice. A daughter of my bloodline would be given in marriage to the verdant court's heir, generation after generation, to keep the peace stitched together. My mother had done it. Her mother before her. When I turned 18, it became my turn, and no one asked whether I wanted it. I told myself I could learn to want it. Prince Cale Thorn was beautiful in the way all Fae were beautiful, dangerous and symmetrical, like a blade dressed as a compliment. In the beginning, he was even kind to me, in small, careless ways, the way a man is kind to a pet he intends to keep. But kindness from Kyle was never the same as choosing me. The Fae court noticed everything I lacked. I did not glow the way Fae women glowed. I did not have magic humming under my skin. No wings, no glamour. No centuries of grace folded into my spine. I had steady hands and a healer's patience. Skills my mother had drilled into me since I could walk. And none of it mattered in a hall built entirely on beauty as currency. They called me the human debt. Some of them, when they thought I couldn't hear, called me the spare. I had one thing I never let them see. A crescent-shaped birthmark on the inside of my left wrist, pale as bone, that I had worn a glove over since I was 12 years old. Ever since a Fae tutor examined it and told me, with a delicate curl of disgust, that it looked like a flaw the goddess had forgotten to fix. I believed her for 6 years. I believed a lot of things they told me for 6 years. The binding ceremony was supposed to be the end of my waiting. Instead, it became the end of my patience. I went looking for Cale an hour before the vows, wanting 5 private minutes before I gave my whole life away in front of strangers. I found him in the East Garden instead, wrapped around Lady Seraphine Vale, a Fae noblewoman with silver eyes and a laugh like breaking glass, his mouth against her throat exactly the way it had never once been against mine. He didn't even startle. That was the worst part. He looked up at me over her shoulder with mild, unbothered irritation, the way you'd look at a servant who'd walked in without knocking. Elowen. He said my name like an inconvenience. This isn't what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. Seraphine laughed. Oh, she speaks. She looked at Kale. I thought you said she was mute with adoration. I don't remember deciding to walk away. I remember the hall doors, the 300 faces turning toward me as I crossed the floor still in my binding gown, whispers rising like smoke. I remember Kale's father, the High King, watching me with the flat, assessing eyes of a man calculating whether this scandal would cost him a treaty. Nobody moved to comfort me. Nobody moved to stop me either. I walked straight out of the palace gates and into the one place Fae law had no authority, the Ashwood Forest, wolf territory, where even Kale's guards hesitated at the border stones. I didn't care what waited for me there. I only knew I would rather face wolves who might kill me honestly than Fae who had spent 3 years killing me slowly with politeness. The forest was darker than I expected, and colder, moonlight falling through black branches in blades. I had gone maybe a mile before I heard it. A low, rolling growl from every direction at once, as if the trees themselves were breathing threat. I stopped. My heart slammed against my ribs. And then, impossibly, my wrist began to burn. Not pain exactly, but heat, sudden and sharp, radiating out from the crescent scar I'd hidden for 6 years under silk and shame. I tore the glove off without thinking. The mark was glowing. Faint silver light pulsed under my skin like a second heartbeat, brighter with every step I took deeper into Wolfland. And I had no explanation for it, no memory of it ever doing that before in my entire life. That was when he stepped out of the dark. He was enormous, not in the animal sense, though I would learn later he could be that too, but in presence, the way a mountain is enormous even from a distance. Black hair, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, eyes the pale gold of a wolf's even in his human shape, and a stillness to him that felt more dangerous than any snarl. He wore no crown. He didn't need one. Every line of him said authority, the way Kale's Fae glamour had always tried and failed to. 2 more wolves flanked him, shifted, teeth bared, and I understood with sudden clarity that I had walked, gown and all, into the middle of the Alpha King's own territory. He didn't look at my dress, torn and half undone from running. He didn't look at my face, streaked with the tears I'd finally let fall. He looked at my wrist, at the mark still glowing faint silver in the dark, and something shifted behind his gold eyes. Recognition, or dread, I couldn't tell which. "Stand down," he said, and the wolves at his sides dropped their hackles instantly, obedience bred into muscle and bone. Then he crouched in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off him like a hearth fire, and took my wrist in one careful hand, turning it toward the moon. "Do you know what you are, little healer?" he said quietly. "Because I don't think you do." "I'm nobody," I whispered, and I believed it completely. "I'm nothing. I'm the human bride the Fae Prince didn't want." Something dark passed over his face. Not pity. Fury, banked and controlled. "You're standing in Ashwood territory with a moon mark burning on your skin," he said, "which means either you're about to become the most dangerous thing that's happened to 3 kingdoms in 100 years, or you're about to get both of us killed tonight. Possibly both." Behind him, in the trees, I heard horns sounding. Fae horns, the unmistakable silver call of Kale's border guard, already crossing into land that wasn't theirs to enter. The Alpha King's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to me, and his grip on my wrist tightened, not painfully, but with a decision already made. "Whatever you were running from," he said, "it just followed you across a line it had no right to cross. That makes you mine to protect now, whether either of us wanted that tonight. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew that for the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at the mark I'd been taught to hate and seen something worth defending instead of something to mock. I had no idea I'd just walked into the beginning of a war. Chapter 2. His name was Rurik Blackthorn, and he was the Alpha King of the Ashwood Pack, ruler of every wolf between the Fae border and the human sea. I learned that much before the Fae horns had even faded from the tree line. He said it flatly, the way a man states a fact he's tired of repeating. And then he turned and started walking, expecting me to follow, as though the matter of my rescue were already settled and beneath further discussion. "You can't just—" I started. "I can," he said, without turning around. "The border stones are singing. Do you hear them?" I didn't, not with my ears. But my wrist still burned faintly, and I understood, with a lurch of dread, that whatever the mark was, it was listening to something I couldn't. The Ashwood stronghold was nothing like the verdant court. Where the Fae palace had been all crystal spires and cruel elegance, this was stone and timber and firelight, built low and solid into the hillside like something that intended to survive centuries rather than merely decorate them. Wolves in human form watched me pass with open suspicion. A few didn't bother hiding a curled lip. "A human," one of them muttered, "in the king's own halls." "With a Fae mark still glowing on her skin," said another. "Ask her whose bride she was an hour ago." I kept my chin up, though my whole body wanted to fold in on itself the way it always had at the verdant court. I had promised myself in that garden, watching Kale's mouth on another woman's throat, that I would never again make myself small to survive a room that had already decided to hate me. Rurik brought me to a private chamber, and for the first time, actually looked at me. Not at the mark, not at the Fae dress still clinging to me in ruins, but at my face. "Tell me what that is," he said, nodding at my wrist. "Everything. Now, before my council decides what to do with you without either of us in the room." So I told him. The betrothal, the treaty. 3 years at a court that measured my worth in Fae currency and always found me short. The wedding that wasn't a wedding. Kyle's mouth on Seraphine's throat. When I mentioned the mark itself, the tutor's disgust, the glove I'd worn since I was 12, something dangerous moved behind Rurik's eyes. "They told you it was a flaw," he said very quietly. "They told me a lot of things. They lied." He said it simply, without softness, as though softness were a language he'd forgotten how to speak. "That mark is a moon seal. Do you know what that means?" I shook my head. "It means before there were Fae treaties, before there was a verdant court to sell human daughters to, there was a pact between the first wolves and the first humans of this land. A bond of choice, not ownership. The moon seal marks the bloodline that carries it. Fae magic can't read it. To them it looks like nothing. A scar, a blemish. Wolf magic reads it the moment it crosses into our land." His jaw tightened. "Which is exactly what happened to you tonight." I felt the floor of my understanding shift. "You're saying the Fae never actually wanted me for me? They wanted my bloodline for the ward, and they couldn't even see what it really was." "I'm saying," Rurik said, "that you've spent 3 years being told you were the lesser part of a bargain, when the truth is the bargain was built on the part of you they were too blind to recognize. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like grief. Grief for 6 years wearing a glove over something that had never been shameful at all. Grief for a girl who'd shrunk herself for people who never deserved the effort." Before I could answer, the doors opened without a knock. A wolf strode in, broad, scarred, with a cold assessing gaze that reminded me unpleasantly of the verdant court's calculating stares. Rurik's spine went rigid. "Draven," he said, without warmth. "Cousin." Draven's eyes slid over me like I was a stain on the floor. Word already reached the pack that you dragged a human bride into your halls. The Fae Border Patrol is demanding her return, invoking treaty rights. And the Council convenes in 3 days to confirm your claim to the throne for another cycle. A claim that, need I remind you, requires a declared mate at your side, which you have refused to name for 6 years. His mouth curved, unkind. How convenient that one fell out of the woods tonight. Careful, Rurik said low. I'm only stating law, cousin. If you cannot produce a true bond by the Council's judgment, the throne passes to the next blood claim. Draven's gaze flicked to me again, colder this time. Mine. The door shut behind him, and the room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Rurik exhaled, and for the first time I saw something crack through his composure. Not fear exactly, but the tired weight of a man who'd been fighting the same battle alone for a long time. He's wanted the throne since the day my sister died, he said quietly, and then, as if he'd said more than he meant to, shut his mouth entirely. I filed that grief away. A sister, a death, a wound he clearly wasn't ready to hand me yet. What happens to me? I asked instead. If the Fae come to that border stone and demand I go back? Legally, under the old treaty, I have no right to keep you. Rurik's gold eyes held mine, steady, deliberate. But if you were under my formal protection, declared as my intended before the Council, no Fae law and no wolf law could touch you. It would buy us time to understand what that mark truly means, and it would answer Draven's challenge in the same breath. You're asking me to pretend to be your bride, I said slowly. The same night I ran from being someone else's. Something almost like humor touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. I'm asking you to survive the next 3 days, Elowen Hart. Whatever this becomes after that is a conversation for people who aren't currently being hunted by 2 crowns at once. Outside, faint but unmistakable, the Fae horns sounded again. Closer now, at the very edge of the border stones, and beneath my gloveless wrist, the moon mark burned brighter than it had all night. Chapter 3. I said yes before I let myself think too hard about what saying yes might cost me. The Council declared me Rurik's intended before dawn, a formality spoken over firelight, witnessed by scarred wolves who did not bother hiding their doubt. It bought me safety from the Fae Border Patrol, who withdrew, furious, promising the matter would return to the High King's table. It did nothing to buy me safety inside Ashwood's own walls. For the first week, I existed the way I always had at the Verdant Court, tolerated, watched, whispered about. Wolves are not Fae. They do not disguise contempt with pretty words. Instead, they simply stopped speaking when I entered a room, or spoke louder about the Fae leftover once I'd gone. I could have shrunk. 6 years of practice had made me very good at shrinking. Instead, on the 4th day, I found the pack's healer's den nearly overrun during a border skirmish. 3 young wolves brought in bleeding, the elderly healer, Mother Yorath, overwhelmed and short-handed, cursing in 3 languages at once. I didn't ask permission. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work, setting a shattered arm, packing a wound that would have killed a boy named Finn within the hour if it went untreated. Mother Yorath watched me work with sharp, assessing eyes, the kind that missed nothing. Fae hands don't know healing, she said afterward, wiping blood from her own. Human hands don't know wolves. She looked at my wrist, where the glove had stayed off since the forest. But that mark knows both, doesn't it? You know what it is, I said. It wasn't a question. I'm old enough to remember the stories before the Fae rewrote them, she said. The first pact wasn't a treaty of ownership. It was a promise between equals, a human line and a wolf line, bound by choice, sealed by the moon. The Fae twisted the story once they inserted themselves into it centuries later, turned a bond of equals into a bride price. Her eyes softened, just slightly. You were never the lesser half of anything, girl. You were the forgotten half of something older and truer than what they sold you into. I didn't cry in front of her. I saved that for later. Alone. when the weight of 6 years finally cracked something open in my chest that I hadn't let move in a long time. Word of Finn's recovery spread through the pack faster than any council decree. Wolves who had refused to meet my eyes began nodding when I passed. It wasn't acceptance yet, but it was a door, cracked open. Rurik noticed. He found me that evening on the practice yard wall, watching young wolves spar in the last light, and sat beside me without asking, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed mine. "You didn't have to save him," he said. "I'm a healer. It's what I'm for." "That's not what I meant." His gold eyes studied me, unreadable. "You could have let them keep hating you. It would have been easier." "I spent 3 years making myself easier to hate less," I said. "It never worked. I'd rather be hated for something true than tolerated for something false." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough that I felt it in my chest anyway. "My sister used to say something like that," he said, and then, before I could ask, added, "Mira, she died 11 years ago. Fae ambush at the border during what was supposed to be a peace envoy. I was supposed to be riding with her. I wasn't." His jaw tightened. I swore after that I would never again let myself care about anything the way I cared about her. Caring gets people killed in this world. Kings especially can't afford it. "And yet," I said quietly, "you pulled me out of the dark on the worst night of my life without a moment's hesitation. That," he said, "was duty." "Was it?" He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. And in the space between us, the silence held something neither of us was ready to name. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire behind us, and everything to do with the way his hand had found mine on the stone wall, without either of us deciding it should. I let it stay there. It was Mother Yorith, days later, who first said the word aloud that changed everything. She'd been studying old pack scrolls, tracing the moon seal through generations, and found me in the garden with ink-stained fingers and an expression I didn't like. "The moon seal isn't just a bloodline marker, child," she said carefully. "It's an anchor. Whoever carries it holds the ward between Fae, human, and wolf lands stable, but only while it's freely given. The Fae court didn't choose your line as a bride price because they loved the tradition. They chose it because binding the moon seal into a forced marriage let them control the ward without ever admitting a wolf-blessed pact existed at all." Her eyes met mine, grim. "And now that you've broken from that binding, the ward doesn't have an anchor holding it anymore." "What happens?" I asked, throat dry, "when a ward like that has no anchor?" "It frays," she said. "And when it frays, whatever's been kept apart for centuries starts bleeding through." That night, for the first time since the forest, my wrist burned hot enough to wake me from sleep. And somewhere beyond the border stones, something screamed that had no business existing in either world. Chapter 4. The screaming turned out to belong to a creature none of us had names for. Something Fae-born, but twisted. Slipped through a thinning point in the boundary near Hartwell, my own village, tearing through livestock and terrifying families who had done nothing to deserve the consequences of a war between crowns they'd never chosen. Rurik rode out with a dozen wolves at first light. He didn't ask me to stay behind, which told me more about how far we'd come than any words could have. I rode with Mother Yorath's satchel of remedies strapped to my saddle, my moonmark aching the entire way like a compass pulling toward disaster. We found Hartwell in chaos, thatch roofs burning, a child crying in her mother's arms, and the creature itself, shapeless and wrong, prowling the tree line like it was deciding what to devour next. Rurik shifted before I'd fully dismounted, enormous and black and terrifying in a way that should have frightened me, and instead steadied something in my chest, because I understood finally that his power had never once been aimed at me. The fight was brutal and fast. I did what I could, pulling villagers to safety, packing a gash on a wolf named Torin's flank, while the battle still raged 20 feet away, my hands steady even as my heart wasn't. When the creature finally fell, dissolving into the same silver-black smoke that Fae magic left behind when it died, the wound in the boundary it had slipped through remained, visible now to anyone who knew to look. A shimmer in the air like a crack in glass. It was Rurik, breathing hard, blood-streaked, who found me pressing a hand to that shimmering wound almost without thinking, and watched my moon mark blaze bright silver in response, the crack sealing, just slightly, at my touch. "You're doing that?" he said, stunned. "Without ritual, without ceremony, just you." "I don't know how," I admitted. "I just wanted it to stop hurting people." "That," Mother Yorith said, arriving breathless behind us, "is the entire point of the moon seal that the Fae never understood. It doesn't answer to ownership or law. It answers to a will freely given to protect what it loves." Her eyes moved between me and Rurik, deliberate. "Which means, Your Majesty, that whoever eventually holds her heart may hold the fate of 3 kingdoms in his hands, whether he wants that burden or not." That night, back within Ashwood's walls, Beta Column, a wolf I'd noticed lurking at the edges of council meetings, always quiet, always somewhere he shouldn't have needed to be, was caught slipping a sealed letter to a Fae courier at the border stones. The letter, when Rurik tore it open in front of the full council, detailed everything: my location, the extent of the ward's failure, even the private council debates about Draven's challenge. Column didn't deny it. "Draven promised me land when he takes the throne," he said, chin lifted, defiant even in defeat. "And the Fae paid in gold for anything about the human girl. Why should I bleed loyalty to a king who's let a mark on a stranger's wrist matter more than his own pack's stability?" Rurik's fury was quiet and absolute. Column was stripped of rank and exiled before the moon had fully crossed the sky, but the damage was already loosed. The High King of the Verdant Court now knew exactly how unstable the ward had become, and exactly where I was. The message arrived at dawn, carried not by a courier but by Cale himself, riding to the Ashwood border stones under a parley flag, alone, without guards, without Seraphine. I watched from the wall as Rurik went to meet him, every line of his body coiled with restrained violence. I didn't want to go. I went anyway. Cale looked different than I remembered. Thinner, less luminous, fear sitting oddly on a face built for arrogance. "Elowen." He said my name like it cost him something now. "You have to come back. The ward is collapsing faster on our side than yours. Creatures are getting through everywhere. My father's own guard can't hold the western gate. Whatever's happening to you, it's killing us. You cheated on me the night I was supposed to become your wife," I said, and my voice didn't shake at all. "And now you want me back because your court is finally paying for a treaty it never respected in the first place. I never loved you the way you deserved," Cale said, and for the first time in 3 years, it sounded almost honest. "But I need you, Elowen. My people need you. Doesn't that count for something?" Beside me, Rurik went very still, and I felt, more than saw, the war happening behind his gold eyes. The fear that whatever this was between us might not survive the weight of an entire kingdom's desperation. "You had 3 years to need me for the right reasons," I told Cale quietly. "I'm done being needed for the wrong ones." I turned and walked back through the gates, leaving him standing at the border stones with nothing but the wind and the truth I'd finally learned to say out loud. But behind me, I heard Draven's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He'd been watching from the wall the entire time. "There it is, cousin," he said to Rurik, cold and triumphant. "The Fae Prince himself confirms the girl was never a true bond. Only a political convenience, now being fought over by 2 crowns. The council will see it exactly the same way at tomorrow's judgment. Your claim to the throne dies with the sunrise, and so does whatever you think you're building with her." Chapter 5. The council chamber the next evening was colder than any room I'd stood in since the Verdant Court, and far more dangerous, because here at least, the people judging me had the power to end everything I'd started to hope for. Draven stood at the center of the circle of elders, composed and certain. "The law is simple," he said. "A king's claim to the Ashwood throne requires a true mate bond, proven and freely chosen, not a political shield adopted in a moment of crisis, and certainly not a human girl. The Fae Prince himself just confirmed was never truly claimed by love." His eyes cut to me, contemptuous. "Prove otherwise or step aside, cousin." I felt every eye in the room measuring me the way the Fae court once had, deciding, before I'd said a word, that I was lesser. I was so tired of being measured. Rurik rose before I could speak. "I have watched this woman pull a boy's life back from the edge of death with nothing but her own 2 hands," he said, voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "I have watched her seal a tear in the world's oldest ward with nothing but will she didn't even know she had. I have watched her refuse a crown offered out of desperation rather than love. From a prince who had every resource in his kingdom and chose to waste her for 3 years instead." His gold eyes found mine, steady, unguarded in a way I had never seen from him. "I did not declare her my intended to save my throne. I declared her because somewhere between the forest and tonight, I stopped being able to imagine ruling anything without her beside me, and I was too much of a coward, until this moment, to say that out loud." The chamber went utterly silent. "Pretty words," Draven said, though something uncertain had crept into his voice now. "But the law requires proof. A true bond, sealed and witnessed. Can either of you offer that?" I thought of everything. The glove I'd worn for 6 years, the shame I'd swallowed for 3, the crown I'd just watched Kale offer me out of desperation and refused without hesitation. I thought of Mother Yorath's words. "It answers to a will freely given." "I can offer proof," I said, and stepped into the center of the circle before I let myself doubt it. I pulled back my sleeve. The moon mark caught the firelight, pale and quiet, waiting. This mark was called a flaw by a court that used my bloodline for centuries without ever understanding what it truly was, I said. "It was never Fae magic. It was never a treaty tool. It's a wolf pact older than any crown in this room. A bond of equals, sealed by choice, not ownership." I looked at Rurik, and my voice steadied on the truth I hadn't let myself say aloud until now. "I'm not choosing you to save a throne, or to escape a Fae court, or because I have nowhere else to go. I'm choosing you because you're the first person in 6 years who looked at what I was ashamed of and called it powerful instead of broken. I love you, Rurik Blackthorn, freely. Not because law or duty demands it, because I want to." The moon mark flared white-silver, bright enough to light the whole chamber, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, a second mark bloomed on Rurik's own forearm, where he'd gripped my wrist that first night in the forest. A mirrored crescent, wolf dark instead of moon pale, the 2 halves of an old pact finally, fully answering each other after centuries of silence. Gasps rippled through the council. Even Draven took an involuntary step back. "That," Mother Yorath said into the stunned quiet, satisfaction plain in her voice, "is a true bond, sealed and witnessed, exactly as the old law requires. I'd say the challenge is answered." But the light hadn't finished. Beyond the chamber walls, a tremor rolled through the ground. Not celebration, but warning. Mother Yorath's face went pale. "The ward," she breathed. "The bond just pulled on it directly. If it isn't stabilized properly tonight, at the boundary stones themselves, under the full moon." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Rurik's hand found mine, fierce and sure. "Then we finish it tonight," he said. "Together." Driven's voice cut through one last time, edged with something almost like fear now. "The boundary ritual hasn't been performed in 3 centuries. No one alive knows if a human can survive channeling that much old magic through an unstable ward." I looked at the crescent mark glowing steady on my wrist. at the man beside me who had just told an entire council he loved me before he'd ever said it to my face alone. And I understood, with a calm that surprised me, that I wasn't afraid of the risk anymore. I was only afraid of shrinking again. "Then I suppose," I said, "we find out tonight whether I survive it." Before we left for the boundary stones, the council formally recognized Rurik's true mate and named me Queen of Ashwood. The coronation would come later, but by law and by the bond, the crown was already mine. Chapter 6. The boundary stones stood at the exact seam between Fae, human, and wolfland, ancient and moss-covered, humming faintly under the full moon like they'd been waiting 300 years for someone to finally listen to them again. Cale was there when we arrived. He'd refused to leave, desperate enough to beg the High King for one more chance at the treaty. Desperate enough, finally, to admit what he'd lost. He looked older in the moonlight, hollowed out by fear for his own collapsing court. "Elowen," he said. And for the first time in 6 years, there was no arrogance left in him at all, only plain, ordinary desperation. "Please, whatever this is between you and the Wolf King, my father is prepared to offer anything. Marriage, rank, whatever you were denied before. Just save the ward. Save my people. I was wrong about everything. I see that now." I looked at him for a long moment, at the boy who'd made me feel invisible for 3 years, now begging in the mud the way I once had, metaphorically in his court. "You're not asking me to save your people because you love me," I said gently, because I found, standing there, that I didn't need cruelty to say the truth anymore. "You're asking because you're finally afraid of losing something you never valued until it was gone. I hope you learn the difference before it costs you everything, Cale. But I'm not the one who's going to teach you that lesson anymore." I turned from him and walked to the center of the stones, where Rurik waited, his hand already extended toward mine. Mother Yorath explained what little the old scrolls preserved. The ritual required both halves of the pact, human and wolf, standing together at the seam of the worlds, offering the bond not as duty or law, but as a choice renewed under the moon that first witnessed it centuries ago. I took Rurik's hand. His mirrored mark and mine caught the moonlight together, and for a moment I felt every fear I'd carried since that garden in the verdant court, every lesson that had taught me I was lesser, unworthy, a debt paid rather than a person chosen, rise up one final time. And then I let it go. "I choose this," I said, my voice steady over the wind. "Freely. Not because a treaty demands it, not because a crown needs it. Because this man saw the mark I was ashamed of and called it powerful, and because I would rather be truly loved by one kingdom than merely tolerated by another." "I choose this," Rurik echoed, his gold eyes never leaving mine. "Freely. Not because my throne requires a mate, because somewhere in a dark forest, a woman with nothing left to lose taught me that caring for someone isn't the weakness I buried my sister's memory believing it was. It's the only thing worth ruling for." The boundary stones answered. Silver light rose from the ground in a column, wrapping around us both, and I felt the old ward, frayed, exhausted, mismanaged by centuries of Fae possession, finally settle into something new. Not ownership, but partnership, exactly as it had been designed before anyone twisted it into a bride price. The tremor in the earth stilled. Somewhere beyond the trees, I felt, rather than heard, the wild magic that had been bleeding through for weeks, finally quiet, folding back into balance. When the light faded, Draven was on his knees at the edge of the stones. Not out of reverence, but because the old magic itself had made its judgment plain to everyone watching. And even he could not argue with a bond the land itself had recognized. "The throne is not mine to challenge," he said quietly, and for the first time, meant it. Cale left before dawn, riding back to a court that would spend generations, I suspected, learning to value things only after they were gone. 3 months later, Ashwood held a coronation instead of a council judgment. I stood at the boundary stones once more, this time in wolf silver instead of Fae binding white. Mother Yorath fastening a leather cord at my throat threaded with a single moonstone. Rurik's gift, given freely. Nothing like the cold iron ring Kale had once put on my finger as a mark of ownership rather than love. The pack that had once whispered, "human," left over behind my back, now knelt as I passed. Not because law demanded it, but because they'd watched me pull their children back from death and seal a wound in the world, with nothing but my own 2 hands. Rurik took my hand in front of the entire kingdom, his gold eyes warm in a way I'd once thought this man incapable of. "They called you the Spare for 3 years," he said, low enough for only me to hear. "I intend to spend the rest of both our lives making sure the world never makes that mistake about you again." I smiled, and for the first time since I was 12 years old, I didn't think of the mark on my wrist as something to hide. I thought of it as home. The girl who once wore a glove to cover her own power stood crowned beneath a full moon, a king's hand in hers, 3 kingdoms finally at peace because of the very thing she'd been told to be ashamed of. And for the first time in her life, Elowen heart belonged completely, not to a treaty, not to a debt, but to a love she had chosen herself. Thank you so much for listening to Elowen and Rurik's story all the way to the end. If you were in her place, would you have forgiven Kyle when he finally came back begging? Or do you think some apologies simply arrived too late to matter? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If stories about unwanted women finding the crowns they truly deserve speak to you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one. There are so many more kingdoms, curses, and second chances waiting to be told.